Hello, and welcome to this month's edition of Family Law Hour. It is my favorite month of the year, and we are going to be chatting about one of my favorite topics, which is marital agreements, often called prenups, sometimes called postnups, depending on when they're entered into. And so I wanted to take a little break from the family law topics we had been doing for the last few months, and those focused more on divorce and custody, and talk today about how to avoid a lot of that conflict and legal fees and litigation around, especially divorce. So, we're going to jump into marital agreements. My name is Lauren Lester. I'm a family law attorney in Colorado, and I help folks break up for the better. And sometimes what that looks like is actually helping facilitate a discussion at the front end that hopefully avoids the future breakup altogether. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, every relationship is different and deserves individual attention. So, today I'm only going to provide information about prenups or marital agreements, and that will be specific to Colorado. That way, you can make the decision that is best for you and your family on whether that type of agreement would be beneficial for you. But nothing that I say should be taken as any sort of legal advice for your particular situation or relationship. If you have a question like that about how it would work or what you should do for your particular relationship, do be sure that you contact an attorney. With that being said, let's jump in and talk about some marital agreements. So I will refer to them as marital agreements because they can be entered into either before or after the actual marriage begins. But a lot of times, what people will call them is prenups. And we'll get into a little bit why that is and why those are more common than them being entered into after the marriage. But a marital agreement is not something that should be considered with a negative connotation. It's much like a life insurance policy or any insurance policy, whether it be for your car, your house, right? You don't buy those policies or enter into that agreement with the insurance company hoping and expecting that something is going to happen, right? You don't expect when you leave your house to get into a car accident or for a tree to fall on your house, right? So a marital agreement works very much in the same way. A lot of folks have a aversion to them or feel negative about them because they think, well, this is just, assuming that we're going to get divorced. And that's really not the case. That's not the way to approach it. But if you think of it more like an insurance policy, where you're putting something in place that will protect you in the future, should something happen, that's not the hope, then that gives it a little bit, probably a better feel. And that really is what these agreements are about. So you don't enter into them because you expect to get divorced. Instead, it really does enforce a conversation between two people who are about to become spouses or even spouses who haven't had this conversation yet, to really talk a lot about, what are the finances, and how are we going to handle major financial decisions in this entity that we are either entering into or already a part of, which is a marriage, right? When we get a marriage license, we're essentially putting a bubble or an umbrella around ourselves and our partners into an entity that the state recognizes. So it's very much like entering into a business contract, right? Or a business relationship. So because of that, because you wouldn't enter into a business relationship with someone without having some discussions about how are we going to handle finances and what happens if, things go south and who's going to be responsible for what, you really shouldn't do the same before you enter into a marriage either, because they're structured similarly, right? The relationship is the romance part of it, right? The ceremony and the love is in the relationship, and that's going to exist whether or not the entity is around those two people or not. But if you are entering into that legal contract or that legal entity with someone else, you really may want to consider having a marital agreement that covers the rules of the road for your particular relationship. It's never the expectation that the marriage is going to end. But if it does, the marital agreement is there to define your own rules for how things should end, right? How things should be divided. Without having a marital agreement in place, the rules are already determined by the state of Colorado and our legislator, right? So that however they say things are going to happen, how marital assets are going to be distributed, how debts are going to be allocated, that's what's going to happen if you don't have an agreement that says otherwise. And it also is going to cover maintenance, so alimony or spousal support, right? All of those rules of the road have already been determined by our legislator. So if you either don't understand how that may work, or you decide that that's not how you want it to work for your particular situation, that's when you want to get a marital agreement. If you want more information about how the default is, what the legislators' rules are for a divorce, for dividing up the assets and debts, for the possible paying of spousal support, go back and watch some of my previous videos from other months. I cover both of those topics in heavy detail. So that may be a good place to start. Is if you're good with how the legislator has figured it out, then you may not need a marital agreement. But if there's even the smallest bit of change that you would want to make, you would need an agreement to be put in place that you and your spouse agree to sort of change those default rules. So, what's the timing of a marital agreement? I sort of mentioned in the beginning that most folks tend to enter into them before the marriage actually starts, right? So, before the date of the marriage. And the reason for that is the reason that prenup is a more common term for marital agreements than postnup is because before the marriage is begun, the parties don't have rights yet as spouses. And so it's sometimes easier to waive those rights or discuss them because you might be giving away something you don't already have. Whereas if their marriage has already begun, you do have rights as spouses. And if your particular marital agreement might be waiving some of those rights or changing them, it can be sometimes a little bit more difficult to let go of something that you already have. So that's why prenups are more common. And it also just, again, forces that conversation that you may realize, and unfortunately I have had this happen, that this person, you guys aren't ready to get married just yet, or maybe this isn't the person that you see long term. And that, although devastating and can be really heartbreaking in the moment, is probably a blessing in disguise because if that's what their position is that you don't agree with on these topics of financials that you haven't necessarily discussed, you don't want to have that discussion in the middle of a divorce, right? Where there's going to be more rules in place. You may be tied. You may be bound by the laws of Colorado. Getting that out in the open ahead of time is going to really shed some light on whether or not y'all are on the same page. So it can be, although difficult, a really good exercise to go through. There is no specific time requirement for how soon before or what gap needs to be in place before the marital agreement is signed and the marriage begins. But what we do want to look out for is any sign that the agreement was rushed into, that the parties maybe didn't fully understand it, that maybe one party might have felt under duress or sort of coerced maybe into signing an agreement. So we don't want to have the situation where one spouse, the day before the wedding says sign this or we're not getting married, right? That's not what marital agreements are for. But I certainly have had spouses who are totally on the same page, fully aware of their agreement, entering it into it voluntarily, signing it a few days before the wedding, right? The more time that there is in between the start of the marriage and the agreement, it is certainly a lot harder to say that either party was coerced into signing the agreement or felt pressured to, but sometimes life just works out that way, right? So there's no specific timeline that you have to meet, but just be considerate that from an outside perspective, are there any concerns that this agreement was rushed into, that either party didn't feel like they were able to take the time or seek the counsel that they wanted to really understand what they were signing. To have a valid marital agreement in Colorado, just has a few requirements. As we just talked about, the parties have to willingly and voluntarily enter into the agreement. It's a contract between two private parties, just like any other contract that you may enter into. The parties also have to knowingly enter into this agreement. And a lot of that comes down to, in Colorado, there's a requirement that there be a full and frank financial disclosure of both soon to be spouses or spouses, depending on when it gets signed, to the other so that each party to the agreement understands what the other's financial picture looks like. That's all the assets that they may have, any business interests that they may have, any debts that they may be holding, and then also what their income looks like, right? What is their earning capacity both for the last year and then also the year to date. So a full and frank disclosure is required. Those are included as exhibits or schedules to the actual agreement itself. And that is so that both parties completely understand what the other has financially, what their earning capacity is, so that if they are potentially giving up rights that they may otherwise have to some of those assets, or potentially taking on liability for debts that maybe they did not incur, there's no question that they were fully aware of what those values were. And what those items were before they entered into the agreement. So the agreements do have to be entered into knowingly with that full and complete financial disclosure. And then the agreement needs to be in writing and signed by the parties, ideally in front of a notary so that there is no question about the signature's authenticity. But that should be a pretty easy requirement to check off. So, what is the purpose of a marital agreement? They are going to cover two specific scenarios. So, there's two ways a marriage can end, which is either by divorce or dissolving of the marriage, or by death. That is going to actually end that entity that two parties enter into that's recognized by the state. So, a marital agreement oftentimes is going to focus on the marriage ending by divorce because the parties are going to need to move on to the next chapter of their lives and figure out how do we take this estate or this property and debt that we have together as a married couple and divide it. So, that's going to be the bulk of why those agreements exist. Most folks enter into them because they are about to get married and want to be able to define the rules for themselves. So, marital agreements will define what is separate property. Separate property is going to be property that each spouse will retain as their sole property, even after a marriage. What is marital property? So, what do the spouses own together that each of them may have a right to, whether or not they're on the title or not? Same with debts, right? How does debts that were acquired during the marriage, are those marital? Are they separate? Is there a little bit of each? If either party has a business interest, how is that business interest defined? And even something as really important but often overlooked as pets, right? If you have a pet coming into the marriage or you adopt a pet during the marriage, how should those pets, where should they go if the relationship ends, right? People often don't think about that. Sometimes they don't want to think about that, but pets are going to be treated like personal property. So if there's not a rule in place and it ends up going to the court and we're going to use the rules that the legislator has put, you may not be very happy with the outcome, right? And that could have been easily avoided by having an agreement and having that conversation in the beginning about, okay, if we get a pet, maybe we're going to amend our agreement, or each of us will be assigned one and we'll alternate. However you want to do it, it's important to include those types of topics. Marital agreements will also define and determine whether or not there should be maintenance paid by either spouse. That's spousal support. A lot of states call it alimony. Whether that should be paid at all, if it is, what the schedule should be. That can all be determined, and you can write your own rules that are different from the default rules for the state of Colorado. They can also define, the agreements can also define any other terms that are important to you in your relationship. So this could be a term that maybe no other agreement out there really has, but between the two of you, it's really important to include. You can do that. It's a contract between the two of you, and so you can write the terms and the rules as you want to. If you do get into something really specific, again, I do recommend that you work with an attorney. You don't want to include any provisions that just in general contract law are not going to be enforceable. But I certainly have had clients in the past include provisions if they anticipate that they will have embryos created or that they will be on a fertility journey, right? Those are going to be unique to each relationship, and you may want to include terms about those in your particular marital agreement. If there's an agreement that exists and the court finds that it is valid because it checks off the requirements, the terms of the marital agreement is what the court is going to follow if there is a divorce. And it makes the divorce process pretty simple if the agreement is drafted well, because we know exactly who's going to get what. We write up a separation agreement as part of the divorce process that follows exactly with the marital agreement, and then the parties are often done. So it's just a lot of paperwork in that point. At that point, without a marital agreement, there can be a lot of conflict and fighting about who gets what, whether maintenance is paid, who gets the pets. And so avoiding that by defining those rules up front is going to save you so much time, so much headache, and so much money in legal fees. So the other scenario that a marriage will end by is death. And so the marital agreements will also cover what happens if one of the spouses dies, and that's the reason that the marriage ends. And so as a spouse, you have rights in the state of Colorado if you are the surviving spouse. So if your spouse dies first and you are the one to survive of the marriage, you have certain rights. And so some couples will decide, depending on where they are in life, what their children look like, if they're minor children, if they're adult children, what relationship is this with them? Is it a second marriage, third marriage? So, depending on where you are in life, some folks may decide to keep all of those estate rights, some of them waive them, some do something in the middle. So, you do also want to consider the rights as a surviving spouse and how your marital agreement will address those. Marital agreements do not and cannot include provisions about children. So, if you're a younger couple and anticipating that you're going to expand your family, we don't include anything in a marital agreement about child support or custody, anything like that. That will always be determined at the time it needs to be determined. If there is a divorce, the court will determine the child custody piece at that point. So, what marital agreements are going to cover are just the finances between the married parties, right? So, assets, debts, maintenance, anything like that deals with the party's actual finances. So, we talked a little bit about what the benefits are. It forces a conversation that a lot of people are reluctant, nervous, scared to have, but it's a really important conversation to have when you're entering into this legal entity with someone else. So you have a conversation with your spouse about, what finances should look like if you buy a house together during the marriage, and one of you puts more down on the house. Does that person get more back should there be a divorce? Is it considered a gift to the marriage, right? Those can be hard and uncomfortable conversations, but they're really important to have, and really important to have, and a lot easier to have when y'all like each other still. As you can imagine, if you have those conversations down the road when the relationship has broken down, you probably don't like each other, right? Somebody has filed for divorce. They can be a lot harder to have that conversation, a lot more emotions, a lot more conflict, and a lot more money. And that's one of the other benefits of marital agreements, is that they will save you a ton of money if there does end up being a divorce. If the marriage doesn't work out, and it needs to be dissolved, you have already written the rules for how that's going to work. So you are not spending a ton on lawyer fees to litigate, over every little thing. And lastly, the benefit is it lets you write your own rules for your relationship. You and your partner know what's best for you and your partner. And so if you want to dissolve the marriage in a certain way, should that happen, again, it's an insurance policy, right? No one is hoping that that will be the case. I write these agreements and always tell folks, I hope you put it on a shelf and it collects a bunch of dust and you never need it. But just like an insurance policy, right? If that tree hits your house, you're going to be really happy that you have that insurance policy. And so these marital agreements allow you to write your own rules for your relationship. You can use the default rules from the state of Colorado as a starting point, but then you'll feel a lot more in control of how your finances would be handled should the marriage dissolve. A quick note about form generators. I'm sure if you have looked into this or have Googled, you certainly can find some templates online of marital agreements. They are super convenient because it generally just takes a quick Google search. But I will provide some caution for those generated marital agreement forms that you may find online or templates that you may find that you try and go through and update your own specific information in. Oftentimes, they are not state specific, and these agreements need to be state specific because they deal with the divorce and death laws, which are going to be unique to each state. So, if you have an agreement that you think looks good, but Colorado requires some special language and yours doesn't have it in there, you could go through all of this work and then have an agreement that's not going to be recognized as valid potentially. So, you don't want to do that. If you're going to take the time to have those hard conversations. Let's make sure the agreement reflects those. And oftentimes, to be quite honest, the ones that folks have come to me with where they've said, oh, we drafted this agreement, we found a form online. Can you review it for us? Thankfully, they have me do that because a lot of times, although the forms are convenient, they tend to cause a lot more issues or leave a lot more vagueness or gaps than they actually fix or any of the benefits that they might achieve. So if you do want to try and save some cost and find your own form or draft your own agreement, I think that's great. But certainly it is recommended that you speak with an attorney, have them review it so that you're not entering into a contract that says something different than you might think it says or doesn't cover a particular scenario, and so now you're potentially fighting about that down the road, and that totally blows up the benefit of the marital agreement. You don't really get to reap as much of a benefit as you might think by doing that hard work in the beginning. So, lastly, you are not required in the state of Colorado to have a lawyer to have a valid marital agreement. You don't. Two parties can do it completely on their own. But as I just said, if you're either unsure of what the agreement says, if you just want to make sure there's no holes in it, if you want to make sure the language is exactly what you think it says and can't be interpreted differently, it's always good to get counsel. At the end of the day, this is a binding contract that you are entering into that deals with your finances. So it's not something to take lightly. It is something to try and get some representation to help you work through it so that you, again, voluntarily, knowingly are entering into this contract with no questions in the back of your head. The good news is that it should not cost an arm and a leg to have either an attorney draft the agreement for you or review one that's already been drafted on your behalf. I personally provide flat fee options for both of those, whether you want it drafted or you already have something done and just want it reviewed. And you can check out all of my pricing and the services that are included on my website, which is mylifelawyer.com. Again, mylifelawyer.com. So hopefully, if you can find those cost-effective options, you can feel even better about entering into a marital agreement because you've gotten that counsel and that just double check to make sure that everything is exactly how you want it. So, hope that was helpful. A quick dive into marital agreements here in Colorado. If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the comments below. Next month, I will be back once again on the second Wednesday to talk about another family law topic and to provide information to make the court system just a little less scary, a little more illuminating. So, do be sure to subscribe so that you get alerts when I go live and you can join me and include your questions in the chat and have them answered right then and there. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next month.